psychology. I'm a social and personality psychologist, and my research is actually on testosterone and leadership, but I'm starting to get really interested in empathy, and these things are all related. So think of this talk as sort of a segue to the talk that's coming up on leadership, because I'm actually going to end with leadership in this talk. So that works out well. Also, feel free to stop me if you have any questions or comments. I'm very, very informal with my presentation, so I encourage that, but I'll also gladly take questions and comments at the end as well. So this quote right here is my shout out to Saturday Night Live in the 1990s. If you remember Deep Thought, Jack Andy. Most people probably don't because you're too young, but that's okay, right? And so this is a series of profound statements, right? Before you criticize someone, you should walk a mile in their shoes. That way, when you criticize them, you're a mile away from them and you have their shoes. I was writing this talk and I was going through some quotes, and my daughter, who's 8 years old, looked at this quote and just dumbfounded. She's like, what? I don't, what? Like, why? It was incomprehensible to her, right? Which is a good thing for me, which means she can't relate to this in any sort of way. And part of empathy is really having that foundation of a shared experience that you can relate to another person, right? And elements of empathy are present at birth, right, which is really important and essential for us because we're social creatures, right? So much of what we do, right, there's a ton of people packed in the room together, right? It's really important that we're able to kind of understand if someone needs a little bit more space, right, or if someone's uncomfortable. It facilitates this social interaction that we have. And there's elements of empathy present at birth. And I want to show you guys a little clip of what some of this is, right? And so this is, if you put something on YouTube, right, it may be shown in psychology lecture. Right, but here we have a little baby. And this is I'll turn off this sound. This is a replication of Andrew Meltzoff's research. And what he did in his earlier research is he got these women to agree to let him come as soon as their babies were born, right, and do these little experiments on their babies. And what he found was that within moments of their birth, in this case there's an infant who's an hour old, if you make a face, if you stick your tongue out, right, that baby is able to imitate that little they're so yummy, right? Right? But it's incredible psychologically, right, what's going on, because this infant, right, just hello world, right, is going, okay, right, you, right, your face, that's important, right, and what you're doing is probably really, really important, and is probably something that I need to be doing. And if it's something that's within, right, this little tiny baby's behavioral repertoire, right, it's going to concentrate and concentrate and try, and, right, and then the little tongue comes out, right? Right? Imitation, right, is one of the foundations of learning. Oh, wait, the whole tongue is coming out again. All right, enough of that. Right, and right, at birth, you see things like imitation, emotion matching, emotional contagion. It's just this straight imitation, right? At 10 months of age, right, when babies have more skills and they can self-regulate, you see that they respond to the affective or the emotional cues of their caregivers, right? So if you've ever been around infants, right, this is when you see them, right, kind of come and like look at mom or dad. It's like, okay, what is that face? What does that mean? Can they like keep calling away? Or is this person scary? Right? And they can read those cues and help regulate their behavior. At 2 years of age, they develop self-agency, right? And you start to see them engaging in pro-social behavior, right? And this is when little kids, again, if you've been around them, they come up to you and they start giving you things. And it's like, here's my favorite toy, right? Because they want to make you happy, right? And so they're realizing that their experiences or their behaviors cause a reaction in you, right? And they want to regulate those behaviors. Right? So that's the foundation of empathy. It's not quite empathy, but it's where it comes from and how it progresses. Now, the Dalai Lama, right, from one extreme to another, right, and we were fortunate enough to have him on this campus and to hear his words of wisdom and talking about the importance of empathy and compassion, right? And he said that we must recognize that the suffering of one person or nation is the suffering of humanity. So the happiness of one person or nation is the happiness of humanity. Right? That's very vague, that's very amorphous. Unfortunately, it's not how we as individuals tend to respond. Right? It's something to strive towards, but it's not what we spontaneously do. And here's a picture, and I promise you, when I put these pictures up, I did not foresee the weather, right? Because it's a miserable rainy day, right? You can kind of empathize with the miserable rainy day that these people are experiencing. Right? But from psychological research, we know that people respond to these different stimuli in very different ways. Right? So for example, right, here's a mass of people who are standing outside the rain in New York. Right? Most people in this room are not going to look at that picture and empathize with them. Right? I mean, it kind of looks like art. Oh, that's pretty, all right, whatever. Right? You don't like, oh, feel the pain of standing out in the cold. Similarly, you view a picture of a homeless person sitting outside in the rain, and what we know from neuroscientific research, where you can actually kind of put people in a machine and look at their brain architecture as well as how they're processing information, most people don't actually look at a homeless person and process him or her as a person at all. Right? This is true for homeless people, and this is true of people who are drug abusers. Right? The area of our brain, the medial prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for social cognition and recognizing other people, it's not active. Right? Instead, people tend to have a very negative reaction to people who are homeless or drug abusers. And philosophically, it corroborates what we know, that it can be so scary for us to think that that can be me, right, in this situation, living on the street, that your mind doesn't even want to go there. It's like, that's not like me, it's never going to be me. You push those people away, and you see very intense negative emotional response. Right? Contrast that again, right, to a group of students walking in the rain. Right? They could have been anyone in this room, right? You see that, and you start to, come in, right? You start to empathize with that. It's kind of like you feel, right? You feel it, you empathize with them, you know what they're going through. Right? And so, one thing I want to do is talk a little bit about what empathy is, because we all talk about it, right? But psychologists tend to define it in very concrete ways. And there's a cognitive component to empathy, or how we think about things, as well as an affective component to empathy, or rather how we feel about things. And this is a measure, a self-report scale that I'm taking this from, but I think it's a good framework for understanding the rest of the research that I'm going to be talking about. Right? So cognitively, right, you can think about what another person's perspective is. Right? It's like, okay, I understand what that person's going through. Right? Similarly, right, and actually very similarly, if you're looking at the brain, right, you can daydream, right? You can pretend you're someone else. If you've ever been lost in like a wonderful book or a wonderful movie, right, you're like, ah, right? You know that feeling, right? Your mind's just going nuts. Right? That's empathy, right? That's that same process. Affectively or emotionally, right? You can see somebody in a difficult situation and recognize that they're suffering and want to relieve that person from suffering, right? You can also take it one step further and actually feel that person's pain as if it were your own, right? This is personal distress, right? Their suffering, right, is your suffering. And one way that all of us experience this personal distress is if you see somebody in physical pain. And did anybody watch the Final Four National Championships? Okay, so a handful of people. So what, are you guys studying or something? It's crazy. Right, so this is unfortunately, this is Kevin where he played at Louisville, and, you know, I don't know how it happened, but he jumped up, came down on his leg, and ended up getting a compound fracture, right? Which means his bone was sticking out of his leg, right? And you can see, right, that the players were just shocked and horrified by it, right? And so, you know, he came down, people realized what's happening, and all of a sudden people in the crowd were like, and they're turning away, people on the bench are turning away, you know, his teammates are, it's their own distress, right? And that's how our brain processes it, right? They weren't feeling the physical pain, right? He was obviously suffering more than anyone else physically in that stadium. But the emotional component to that, right? We know from neuroimaging studies that it was the same. It's a shared negative social experience, right? Which glues people together, right? If you know someone's feeling pain and it hurts you as much as it hurts them to some degree, you're going to work to alleviate that person's suffering. Unfortunately, not all empathy works like that, right? And how we feel is largely dependent on what our relationship is to the person that we're potentially empathizing with, right? So right here we have ourselves, right? And you can have a friend, right? You kind of like, you share a lot, right? This is my BFF, my thoughts are her thoughts, right? And so if you have a friend like you finish each other's sentences, things like that, right? You kind of know there's a little bit of a version of self there, right? As opposed to a stranger, it's like, oh, okay, right, you're a person, right? That's fine and dandy, right? Well, interestingly enough, our brain processes social pain in much the same way as it does physical pain. And this is the evil genius of social psychology. So there's this little game called Cyberball that a psychologist, Pip Williams, came up with. And it looks really benign, right? It's like you have these little avatars, and they're throwing the ball back and forth, right? Not even in person, it's just like online, back and forth, right? Well, in the early experiments, right, you're a participant in the study, and there's other people that you're ostensibly playing with. Of course, the researchers are manipulating this and figuring out who gets the ball when. You don't know this, of course. And these other people stop throwing the cyberball to you. And you're like, okay. Okay. Right? Ostracism, right? Social rejection. It starts to really, really hurt. Right, and unfortunately, I'm sure all of us can kind of go back in our childhood, and at some point, right, the worst thing that can ever happen to you is, you know, your friends are like, well, we're not friends with you anymore. It's like, oh, right, it's social pain. It hurts. It hurts really, really badly. And, right, it's so fundamental to us that this little experiment, right, replicates that social pain. And our brain processes social pain the same way it does physical pain, right? The areas associated with the emotional stress, or the emotional distress of being ostracized. Now, in some of these experiments, say you go in, right, to be in this experiment, and you're with a friend, right? You're playing cyberball, and you notice that the other people aren't passing the ball to your friend. It hurts the same way as if they're socially rejecting you, right? You feel that physical, emotional, not physical, but rather the emotional pain of rejection. If it's somebody else, though, a stranger, that you see being socially rejected and ostracized, you're like, oh, right, you empathize with that person, right, but it's not to the same degree. It's not that physical pain sensation, but rather, right, it's more of a cognitive imagined pain. It's like you recognize, like, okay, that's too bad. We should do something about this, right? But it's not the same way as if it was yourself. Now, there are also, of course, besides having friends and strangers, I'm sure, right, we could come up with a little map of this room and figure out who the high status people and who the low status people are, right, besides just the people on the seats and the floor, right? Which again, it's amazing how things work out, right? Right, but we all know, right, there's professors, there's students, there are administrators, right? Some people just have high status and some people have lower status. Socioeconomic status, right, how much money you have is an indicator of social status. In Naomi Eisenberg's lab, she's done studies in which she's had people reflect on what their level of status is, right? So how, what's your status within a college community, for example? And what she finds is that people of lower status, when they're thinking about this question, automatically activate the empathy networks in their brain, right? They're imagining the perspectives of other people. People who have higher status don't do this, right? It never occurs to them to think of other people, right? She's also looked at socioeconomic status among children, have them be pictures of angry faces, and what she finds is that kids from lower socioeconomic status activate those empathy networks, activate the emotion networks from viewing angry faces, more so than kids from a higher socioeconomic status, right? Which is an interesting implication, right? You have high status, you don't really have to consider other people, right? It's not something that these people are spontaneously doing.
Do you think it's more based on the fact that they don't understand the pain that maybe those faces are making? They have an understanding so they can empathize? from a socioeconomic status? Because that seems to be like something that could skew the results.
Well, so they've done 2 studies looking at that, looking at the neural networks associated. But yeah, there definitely should be new studies. This is a study that came out in January 2013, so certainly follow-up studies are needed. But I want to continue talking about this though too, because looking not so much at group-based status, and let me know if this kind of helps out, and stop me again if your question's still there. Like socioeconomic status, right? But you can also look at physiological markers of status. And this is the research that I do is on testosterone. And testosterone is a biological marker of status striving, right? Your desire to be in a high status situation. And I look at testosterone as a personality trait, right? So even though testosterone levels can fluctuate, more or less somebody high in testosterone, right, has high testosterone on most days. And I compare men relative to men and women relative to women because men tend to have higher testosterone levels than women do. And what we find in research I conducted with my colleagues is that people high in testosterone prefer to be in high status situations, or rather they do better in high status situations. And so if you put them in a competition with one another and you kind of rig the outcome, who wins, who loses, who has high status, who has low status, people higher in testosterone function better when they've attained a high status position, right? They're cognitively, they perform better, they have lower heart rate, they're emotionally feeling pretty good. Sort of counterintuitively, people low in testosterone actually perform better in a low status situation, right? They don't want to win these encounters, right? You flip it and you put a low testosterone person in a high status situation or a high testosterone person in a low status situation, you see evidence of cognitive impairment, emotional arousal, their heart rate goes up. They're just not as comfortable, right? They also, right, testosterone influences how people kind of view ambiguous situations. So if you guys have ever heard of like the Rorschach test or the thematic perception test, when you show people these, you know, like a picture, for example, of 2 people running, and you ask them to describe it, this can give you a window into how they sort of see and interpret the world. And what research from Schultes and his colleagues has found is that people high in testosterone will look at a picture like this in terms of power imagery, right? Someone high in testosterone might see this as 2 people like racing each other in the finish line, I'm going to get you, right? Trying to go as fast as they can. Someone low in testosterone might look at that picture and say, oh, you're out for a jog, look at that, right? Right? So 2 people running, but a completely different interpretation, right? There's not that power struggle that someone high in testosterone might have. Right? Some research looking at case studies of people undergoing testosterone injections finds that when being given testosterone, people tend to use less social language. They just refer to other people less often in their writing in terms of both emails and diaries. And this led me to wonder, right, whether or not we could use language as a way to understand how people high and low in testosterone would think about the world. Because these words that we don't really think about, so not the content words of what you're trying to say, but rather how it is you're trying to say it, can tell us psychologically about what you think of your relationships with other people, right? So for example, the words I use specifically, right? When you're talking, right, I am saying this, how are you perceiving it, right? There's an amount of social connection that you can see within writing, or speaking for that matter. And so I did 2 studies. In the first study, I brought participants in the laboratory and I told them that they were going to be applying for a position on a psychology panel in which they'd be able to make recommendations about participating in studies and things like that. So it was an influential position. And all they had to do was write for 10 minutes about why they'd be good for this position, right? I then went through and I analyzed what they wrote and looked specifically for I and you. And so here are some examples of a low testosterone and a high testosterone person, and I highlighted the pronoun uses. But I want to bring your attention down here, right, to the summary statement. And this low participant person wrote, I hope that all my good, strong qualities are what you are looking for in your panel. If you need a strong-willed, open-minded, great listener and a highly educated person, I am the one for you, right? So in the writing, right, back and forth, me, you, right? There's a social connection that's really, really apparent. Contrast that with this example of a high testosterone writing, right? So you can see from the color coding, right? There's no U's whatsoever, right? Fewer versus I's. But down here at the end, right, it's really, really apparent. This person wrote, I have learned how to table an issue, make a motion, and be brief. These experiences qualify me for this position. There's no acknowledgement of the reader in this writing, right? It's almost like a lack of a social awareness. And if you look at the data, right, just the sheer number of IMUs that people use, you see people low in testosterone, right? They're using you, they're using I. People high in testosterone, right, aren't making those connections, right? They're just not doing it. I also did a second study, right, because it's true that I'm sure many of you in your classes have had professors tell you you shouldn't really be using pronouns, right? Prove it, don't believe it, right? No I and you, just right, make your case. Mm-hmm. So some people could argue that people higher in testosterone, right, they're just more motivated to get it, and so they're using the best writing possible. So in Designing City 2, we changed it from an internship application to just 2 people in a room together, right? So we had them compete in a competition, put them in a room together, and said, all right, the experimenter has to go take care of some things, she'll be back, right? Just talk, have fun, knock yourselves out, right? We videotaped this conversation, later transcribed it, and went through the same analyses, right? And what we found was exactly the same pattern of results, right? People high in testosterone weren't referencing you or I in their spoken language to anywhere near the same extent as people lower in testosterone, which is kind of remarkable, right? You're in a room with somebody else, and you never say you, right? Even though you're stuck there for 15, 20 minutes, right? There's just that lack of connection in their spoken language, right? So we can see from this study, right, that testosterone seems to inhibit that social connection, that social awareness at the very, very beginning. That's a necessary component of empathy, right? You can't empathize with someone if you're not really even considering them from the outset. We also know from research by John Van Hahn is that testosterone also inhibits empathic accuracy. And there's a test called reading the mind in the eyes, and this is you can Google it and do it online. It's kind of fun, actually. What you're given are a series of pictures, right? And it's literally just this, right? And your task is to pick which of these 4 words this person is conveying through just the eyes, right? And what we know from this research is that people high in testosterone or people who are given testosterone injections aren't very good at it, right? Testosterone actually inhibits your ability to infer the emotional state of another person. Also, Dana Carney's done some research looking at empathic accuracy and how that relates to leadership ability. And so, in one of the studies in this paper, she looked at MBA students, and she had them all rate one another on their empathic accuracy, so how good they are in inferring the mental states of another person, as well as how good of a leader they think they are, and her measure of leadership is interpersonal leadership. So questions like, I trust this person to make decisions, taking other people's perspectives into account, right, things like that. And what she found was that people who had high levels of testosterone weren't rated as being especially good at inferring the mental or emotional states of their fellow students. They were also not rated as very good at interpersonal leadership. People just didn't trust them to take them into account, right, if they were in a position of leadership, right? Which is interesting, given what we know about testosterone, because testosterone, right, is this biological marker of status driving. So people who have a high level of testosterone want to be leaders, right? They want to be in charge. They want to be in the high status position. But people don't necessarily trust that those people high in testosterone understand their situation, right, are going to act with that information should they be in a position of leadership. And so, again, this is looking at my research on, okay, so if people don't trust you, how do you necessarily get into a position of leadership to begin with, right? And I would argue that it depends on the situation, because people who have high levels of testosterone, right, they're not walking around, right, in sort of high testosterone way. We know that testosterone only exerts an influence in certain situations, right? Otherwise, our self-perceptions guide how we behave, right? So normally, somebody who wants to be a leader, right, is going to choose to be a leader. Testosterone, on the other hand, we would predict from animal research, predicts behavior in challenging situations. So, for example, social troops, any pick your primate, basically. Testosterone isn't going to predict which animal is going to attain alpha status or leadership status within the troop unless it's a time of social instability. Right? So if they're fighting, there's a lot of unrest in the troop, that's when testosterone predicts social stability. Otherwise, it doesn't. Right? Okay. So I wanted to look at if this was more or less the same in humans, right? Can we predict when people would want to be leaders? And so I brought participants into the laboratory. I looked at their self-reported dominance. I also took a sample of their testosterone levels. I then selected people to lead either an agreeable or a hostile group. And I told participants that they were going to take part in a focus group on family planning. And that the leader's job was to solicit input from the group and decide on a recommendation. Right? We then took their attitudes on abortion, which is a very contentious topic, and we asked how much they would want to be a leader. Right? So this is their desire for leadership at time 1. And these are just the 3 simple questions we asked. How much would you like to lead the group? How comfortable would you feel? And how confident do you feel you'd be deciding on a recommendation? We then manipulated whether or not the group that they were essentially going to be leading was confrontational or agreeable. We said, all right, so we have, I've selected you to be a leader of this group. In the confrontational condition, I said, I need to be upfront with you and tell you the discussion may get quite heated. About half of the members are for one's right to choose, and the other half are against it. As leader of the group, it may be very difficult for you to get everyone to come to a consensus and sign the written statement. I can assure you, based on my experience with previous focus groups, that this is probably going to be a very heated discussion and therefore a difficult job for the leader. If you're having second thoughts about your role as leader, you need to indicate it on these forms so I can select a new leader, right? So a very difficult group, right? That a lot of people, right, when I said this, you could just see their faces going, no, right? It's not something that most people would want to do. And the agreeable condition, I just said I want to be upfront with you and tell you the discussion will probably go quite smoothly. I still want to know, essentially, if you'd still like to be leader, right? We then said, you know, it's up to you. Just let me know if you'd still like to be leader. And so we took their desire for leadership at time 2. Are you willing to lead the group? Would you prefer that someone else did? If you're not willing to lead, but no one else in the group indicates they're willing to, are you willing to reconsider, right? And took the average of that. And consistent with predictions, right? At time 1, just in general, would you lead a focus group? Right? The only thing that predicted that, right, was their self-report. Right? If you consider yourself someone who would like to be a leader, right, when asked, would you like to lead, those people said yes. Testosterone didn't influence that whatsoever. There's no predicted utility of it. Contrast that with their desire to lead when they were told it was a difficult confrontational group, right? And so what this graph is telling you, so this is just people in the disagreeable condition. These are people high in testosterone with high self-reported dominance. It's like, okay, yep, I'm on it, right? I'll lead that group. Everyone else is like, no, right? And so it's important, right? Because testosterone only emerged during conflict, right? Testosterone predicted that follow through when things were really, really difficult, right? Under threat, which has interesting implications, right? And so the people who are most willing to lead in difficult times, right, are those who we know from research, are the least able to consider and correctly identify the perspective of other people, right? Right? I get to this point and I can't even process it anymore, right? It's like, yeah, okay, right? And it's not that they're bad people, right? That's just sort of the way it is, right? They're the people who can go through that terrible, awful, difficult decision to get to a leadership position, right? And to go through all that strife and that difficulty, you have to, in some way, be able to distance yourself from the emotional experience of another person, right? Because it is terrible, right? But once you're there, you really want your leaders to be able to connect with you and understand you, right? So I always think of Bill Clinton, right? For those of you who don't know who he is, he had this saying, right? Where he's like, I feel your pain. He's like, oh, you didn't, right? Because any politician who gets to a position of president or senate, right, has gone through numerous of these difficult, contentious, awful battles, right? It's a very select group of people who end up in a leadership position on the national stage. So unfortunately, that's pretty much where I'm going to leave you guys. But on a little bit of a higher note, right? Because again, right, bringing it back to what the Dalai Lama said, that we must recognize that the suffering of one person or one nation is the suffering of humanity, that the happiness of one person or nation is the happiness of humanity. But the Dalai Lama is a leader, right? He has a very, very high status position, right? And I would never accuse him of lacking in empathy whatsoever, right? And I don't know how many people saw him talk when he came here. Okay, fantastic. I mean, he was odd man out on that stage, right? You had the most important, influential people at the college up there, right? And then there he was, and he was acting so differently from everyone else, right? And even when people ask questions in the audience, he's like, who? Right? And he would like have that connection with that person, right? Each individual person, right? Even on the stage, he's like, hello, right? And so leaders have the capacity to make that connection with other people, right? We just have to figure out how they do it, right? Which I would like to do. And I'm actually working on research with Professor Cronus. If any of you know her, we're collaborating with a couple of institutes. I wish I could tell you more about it, but we haven't collected any data yet. And it would be very unwise of me to tell you my hypothesis before testing that. Yeah.
I was wondering what other factors you were considering in affecting leadership besides testosterone. Like, were there, because clearly there are other components that affect one's ability to lead outside of just testosterone, and if you had done any research on that, or what you're...
Yeah, so there's lots of people have done lots of research on leadership. And so my research, I don't look so much at leadership ability, so how good people are at being leaders. There's generally two classes of leaders. There's sort of the people who get things done, they're very administrative, things go okay, as opposed to the more interpersonal leadership styles or transformative leadership. I would suspect maybe that testosterone is related to that, but I can't really speak to it. Rather, I can speak to the people who both want to be leaders and have the ability to kind of fight through some situations that are difficult and emerge as leaders. But of course, not all leaders have to do that, right? There are a number of wonderful leaders who get there, right, because they have a broad base of support, right? You are the best person for the job, and we also believe and want you to do it, and you just continue rising up. And so people get there a number of different ways. This is just one of those paths under, I would argue, very difficult situations we can protect those people. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
So what about women with high levels of testosterone, but at the same time social pressure and social dynamics expect them to have that emotional aspect to them? Do you know what were the statistics about women in that particular situation?
Yeah, so we know that men and women behave the same way. As to how that impacts their success in the labor market, I think it's a different scenario. There's actually Jessica Holmes, and I think someone else in economics is doing research looking at that specifically, and what they find is testosterone exerts an influence on leadership style and behavior at a couple of different points in development. And organizational effects, like the testosterone you're exposed to in utero, is an important predictor as well, and you can see it in certain physiological markers. But what she found is that women who are exposed to higher levels of testosterone in utero, you would expect to be more aggressive in terms of seeking dominance, but also less empathetic, actually make less money, right? So they're not as successful in the labor market. And one interpretation, again, is that because these women aren't acting the way women are supposed to act, because we all know all women have wonderful interpersonal skills and they all care very deeply about everyone else's experiences, they might be punished for that. And there is definitely a wealth of research that shows that women who behave counter-stereotypically, as well as men who behave counter-stereotypically, are judged harshly by other people. Yeah, great question.
On one of your figures, you had like a standardized testosterone level with -1, 0, and 1.
Yeah.
How did you measure testosterone in your subject?
Yeah, so when I measured testosterone, I didn't want to include this because I didn't know what people's backgrounds were, but I looked at saliva, and testosterone that's psychologically active can cross from the blood into saliva. And so I did that using a radioimmunoassay or sometimes an enzyme immunoassay. And then, so we can make men and women relative to one another, I standardized it. So the mean is at 0. 1 is 1 standard deviation above the mean, and -1 is 1 standard deviation below the mean, but with gender standardized. Yeah.
You mentioned that status has kind of a high, there's a high correlation between status and thinking that physiological measures of testosterone are one component of that, but that you also mentioned socioeconomic status studies. So I'm wondering if there's been any studies done, or you guys have looked at the interaction between those things. So for example, if someone of low socioeconomic status who still has high testosterone, maybe they don't have the same type of maybe they don't demonstrate the same lack of empathy and leadership as people of high socioeconomic status. I don't know if there's been studies.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and it's certainly something I'm concerned with and cognizant of. I guess the practicality of the research makes it a little bit difficult to look at. And I will say this. So the testosterone research that I do often utilizes at college samples, so college students for an introduction to psychology. The research that other people do is a convenient sample, so people around a university who are paid to participate in this. And so it's the middle range of testosterone, because if you look at prison populations, for example, right, that's actually high testosterone. Right, and the studies that have compared people from college as opposed to prison populations, there's huge, huge difference. The same thing's true of socioeconomic status. I mean, the sad truth is that if you're born into a family of means as opposed to a family of limited means, right, that's going to greatly impact whether or not you go to college at all. And so it's an important question, a good question, and I'm very interested in it, but it's been difficult to test. I do look at things like gender and race. We don't find differences based on gender, and usually if you look at race-based differences and status associated with that, we don't see anything, but again, the sample sizes are so skewed, it's difficult to make a good comparison. It's a great question. Yeah.
Is there any research regarding testosterone levels and positions of leadership that are elected versus selected? So like the Dalai Lama was selected as a baby and put in this role versus President Clinton and any other president who's been, gone through those battles and elected in a position.
Yeah. It's one of those things where politicians, I have not asked them, but I'm pretty sure they wouldn't let me take their saliva samples. Maybe it's just my own preconceived notion, but it just seems like they wouldn't, so I have not looked at that. I don't know. I would expect, right, based on some of the laboratory studies, that there's a difference, but I'm not sure. You can look at historical data, and one thing that you find is that people serving in Congress, they tend to have military history, they tend to have been lawyers, right, at a much greater degree than the general population. And we do know from research by James Dabbs and his colleagues is that lawyers, especially trial lawyers, tend to have higher testosterone, and soldiers serving on the front line tend to have higher testosterone as well, which makes sense given that these are contentious situations you're constantly battling. So you can kind of infer that they probably would, but no studies have tested that. Questions?
Have you had a chance to consider testosterone levels across different cultures? Because it seems to me that there's significantly fewer women politicians or women in positions of power in Western cultures in comparison to sort of in the Asian culture. Or, I mean, I don't want to generalize, but have you just looked into comparison to testosterone?
Yeah, no, I haven't done that research. Most of the research about testosterone is actually done in the Netherlands, as well as the United States, and so I guess you can make that comparison, although the culture is very similar. I would say that the difference for that we probably had to do more with our relationship to other people. So one of the dimensions in which cultures differ is individualism versus collectivism. And individualistic cultures like America, we're less likely to kind of take other people into our definition of self, right? There's a little bit more of a distance as opposed to collectivist cultures in which you tend to see kind of like with friendship, that more of that social connection.
So you would argue that even people with higher testosterone levels would have less of a sense of disconnect?
It's a great question for future research. Yeah, I'm not sure, but that would be a reasonable hypothesis, definitely.
So I'm only an intro-psych, but it seems like a lot of things we've learned so far, they've been like, oh, and look, it makes a lot of sense when you look at it like evolutionary type way, like all these things are good. Do you have any hypotheses as to why people with higher testosterone assume these leadership positions if they end up being worth empathizing?
That's a good question. So I would say, and I think I know your textbook, which has a strong evolutionary component to it, and I would say that it's not necessarily that these things are good, but rather that it makes sense given the pressures that we've encountered throughout history. You can see why perhaps some of these things have evolved. And to that, I would say it has to do with what we know based off of comparative research, right? So looking at the animal troops, for example, right? In every other kind of animal species besides human beings, right, you see that dominance is based off of who's the biggest, who's the strongest, who's the toughest, right? So if you ever watch Nova or any of those Discovery Channel things, right, the alpha male's like doing this and like, right, and just showing like I'm big and I'm scary and stay away from me, right? Because if someone's going to take over his position, it's because he's bigger and he's stronger, right? And these things are won in battles. And so you get this match between physical size, which is mediated by testosterone level, right? Because testosterone also contributes to size and muscle mass and some of these very dominant facial characteristics as well. And so I think that's why, right, we see that in our species, right? But hopefully, fingers crossed, there's no fight breaking out in this classroom, right? So as a society, we've decided that fighting is not the way to attaining status, right? But we still have all these behaviors associated with it from our evolutionary history. Yeah, that answer your question?
Yeah.
Other question? Yeah.
Because this study involves sexual chemistry, is there any research or did you do any research in terms of sexual orientation and how that affects empathy?
I have not looked at sexual orientation and empathy, in part because we don't find sex differences based off of gender and empathy, and as mediated by testosterone levels. But I haven't looked at it, no. Do you have any predictions about that?
Well, I would just think that a more straight heterosexual man would have higher levels of testosterone, and therefore, according to your study, be less empathetic.
Yeah. Okay. You know, there is one study that looked at sexual orientation and testosterone levels. It's not the best study in the world, I would say, but it does. I would say sexual orientation is probably more multifaceted than just this one biological component.
Yeah.
There is evidence researching that there's a component to it, and so that might play into it. I would also say experiences have to do with it as well, because we talked about social status and being a majority versus minority member would probably influence it as well. That's a good question.
Can your baseline testosterone grow like with time? Well, because I know it can like spike in terms of situations. But once you're done developmentally or like kind of growing fundamentally and psychologically, neurologically, can your baseline also increase over time?
No studies that I know have looked at it long enough. Right, we know that testosterone has a huge increase in puberty, right, and there's changes associated with that that you can see throughout the lifespan. Testosterone responds to situations, and so if you win an event, like if you win a challenge, for example, testosterone levels rise in men at least. And there are theories that testosterone level, if you have enough wins, can over time elevate your testosterone, slowly increasing your mean testosterone level. But no studies actually tested that and kind of proof for it. It's more of just a theory that people are kind of thinking about, but not directly testing. And then we also know that once you reach later age, testosterone